Coming up on Man Enough.
You don't go out over lunch and buy one blowjob and then sit in the cubicle next to another woman and think of her any differently from the woman you just bought.
Why is it that when you win a big game, why is it when you have a birthday, why is it when you get married, the action is to go and commodify a woman? Why are we using that as the act of celebration? That's what we're teaching young men. That's got to be part of the conversation about how we actually end the crime of human trafficking.
Kind of a perfect opportunity for men to talk to their boys about how that's obviously bad for women, but is that the kind of guy that you want to be?
Being man enough, what does that mean?
It's really manly to mess up, admit you're wrong, and then grow.
I couldn't accept that I was evil, so maybe I'm broken, but those broken things could be corrected.
Intimacy between a father and a son is me just wanting to put my head in your lap.
I love you, son.
You haven't called me benevolent sexist, but my experience is women are better.
Even if it's a positive, it's still not equality.
I don't blame men for that. I just blame the system.
This is
Man Enough.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Man Enough. I'm Jamie Heath.
I'm Liz Plank.
And I'm Justin Baldoni.
He's here.
He's here in spirit, sitting right here, but he is also in the edit room editing a movie right now. So he sends his love and regards and cares about what we're going to talk about today very much. How you been?
I'm good. Yeah, I have a big girl crush on the two women that we're having on. Yeah, I'm playing it cool right now, but I'm a little sweaty.
I certainly can say appropriately when a time in my life I had some crushes too.
Yes, they were up there.
With that, I'm excited because we are trying to do work, Liz, and make a difference. And as I always say, it's not the big blast and big event that changes the world, but it's the everyday having a chisel and a hammer and chipping away every single day with commitment and diligence that actually has impact and that is sustainable. And I think the people that we have on today are in fact doing that very work.
Yeah.
Walk around with a hammer and chisel, sometimes unpopular. Hopefully it should be popular. So we should bring them on.
Yeah, let's do it. We have two badasses. So the first one is Ashley Judd.
Who?
I know.
Say it again.
You may know her.
Say it again.
Ashley fucking Judd, all right? She's a celebrated actress, a passionate advocate for social justice and women's rights. I will say, when I was a little tiny Liz and I didn't know what feminism was, I remember seeing Ashley Judd in 17 magazine with a "This is what a feminist looks like" t-shirt. And she was opening it and I was like, she's so cool. Maybe I can do that too. I can be a feminist. So has been inspiring generations of women through her work for years. So she's been in 22 countries and engaged directly with communities to fight gender inequality and male sexual violence. She had an amazing TED Talk that went totally viral. She was honored by the United Nations as the Global Advocate of the Year. And a fun fact, she actually lives part of the year in the Central African rainforest in the Democratic Republic of Congo with her partner, because he has a bonobo research camp. And bonobos are our favorite monkeys because, first of all, are our closest relative, but they have a matriarchal society. And they have overcome sexual violence through female solidarity. So we have a lot to learn from Ashley Judd, a lot to learn from bonobos. And we are also joined by Catherine Chen, who is the CEO of Polaris, an incredible organization who's at the forefront of the fight against sex and labor trafficking in the United States. She's worked for pretty much every cool administration there is and has worked intimately with governments trying to solve this really big, important problem. She's held key roles at Humanity United, Save the Children, and they both are doing incredible work in the realm of sex trafficking, and that's what we're going to be digging into today.
Let's get into it. Ashley, Catherine, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me and for having me with my hero, Catherine. And I'm a big fan of the podcast, and you do good work. You are doing good work.
Well, thank you. Received.
Likewise, it's so great to be in conversation with you all. And I cannot wait to stir up a little trouble with Ashley.
I love it.
We love it. You know, before we get started, we'll ask a couple questions just to kind of get us into it. But I do want to say, Catherine, as I will learn more about you and honor the work that you have done throughout your career, I have already been familiar for many years with Ashley. And it's an honor to be talking to you. Your life's work and what you've done as an artist is incredible. Your mother and sister, when I was younger, coming from the music world, always championed them, and I know they were very successful. And so you're a part of that as well. So I have known your work and had a crush on you when I was many, many, many years ago. And then
Thank you.
and also what you have dedicated your life to beyond as an artist, but also for your advocacy for the evolvement and advancement of humanity is really wonderful to see from an artist. So thank you for your service and your work and for joining us.
Thank you, Jamie. The way I feel about it is that I've been very fortunate to be welcomed into these spaces, and I've been trusted, and I've been given opportunities that were unusual. And I'm grateful that I had adverse experiences as a child that made me interested and wounded and passionate and gave me the heart for it. And that I've been given a skill set, and a lot of mentors that showed me the way. It showed me the way.
Beautiful. So I would say that why are we having this conversation on our show Man Enough? Man Enough is about redefining what the word masculinity means or as it pertains to men. And of course, this affects women as well and all genders, but primarily we've done this to reach the hearts of men and how to kind of reframe our thinking. And this subject, I think, is one that is so important because I do believe that men have some learning to do and how we have I, as a man, I'll speak for myself, contribute to the ills of the world. Not purposely, but I certainly have. And I want to unlearn and no longer do that. I want my legacy to be one that did the opposite, that actually helped the world instead of contribute to some of the ills. So this is why I think it's really important to have on our show and for our listeners. Should we just ask some simple, our normal question, or should we jump in? Can you both tell us in a bite-sized piece, when is the last time that you did not feel enough?
My friend, would you like to go first or would you like me to go first?
You go first.
So I did listen to the episode with Dr. Mate, and it stood out to me that he said that that's a perception, it's not a feeling. And, something that comes up for me is, so I'm in recovery 18 years, and I've really worked on cultivating a relationship with a God of my understanding. And I really believe that I am a spiritual being having a human experience. Mm-hmm. And I have defined my life's purpose as being here to heal. And so I came into recovery with the core belief that I was too damaged to heal. A man molested me for the first time when I was 7. I went to 2 adults and they said, "Oh, he's a nice old man." That's not what he meant. And then a man tried to kidnap me when I was in a Kmart, which for those who don't know what a Kmart is, it's a little bit like a Target, when I had on my green and gold cheerleading uniform. And I have no conscious memory of that, but there's still a police record, and he is a registered sex offender in Rutherford County, Tennessee. I was commercially sexually exploited when I was 15 years old, and I was allegedly modeling in Japan. It was commercial sexual exploitation. So I had a lot of healing to do. And what I did was I flipped that script of I'm too damaged to heal into it is my birthright to heal. I am healing. I was born to heal. Healing is my mandate. I am healing right now. And so it's not so much about the perception that I am not enough, but sometimes I can feel that I don't have my place. So it's a little bit of a difference for me. And to just be really candid about what that can look like for me, my life kind of comes in bursts where I'm writing a book. And so I can have a beautiful chapter, or I can do a powerful podcast like this with an incredible person like Catherine Chen and the 2 of you. And then I just do all this deep spiritual work, and I don't necessarily have a public profile. And it's like, oh, where's my place? And then I'll have an experience where literally a woman will see me on the street and she'll get down on her knees and she'll say, "Thank you." And I know that that's not about me. That's about an experience she's having inside of herself and healing something that's inside of her. And then I'll go, oh, my place is with the God of my understanding. And I'll be reminded of who I really am. So
beautiful. Wow. Thank you for sharing that.
And I want to reinforce that, because I think the way that Ashley and I became friends was I went to her because I was being attacked online. And, being a woman of color, leading a national organization, getting into a place where people want to dismantle you, take you apart for both your femaleness, but also for the fact that I am a child of immigrants. I first went to her with, what do I do with this level of bullying, with this level of hate, with this level of misogyny that I see on a day in and a day out basis? And how do I set myself sturdily on the ground so that I can keep moving, and not only keep moving for myself personally, but for this organization that I lead, for this movement that we're part of, for all of the victims and survivors that we are fighting for. And so that's, I definitely want to reinforce what Ashley said about her supernatural gift of healing and truth speaking. But I would say that that's been, being in charge is often one of the most humbling things, right? Kind of often feel like you're not quite enough.
Wow.
Oh my God.
Oh my God. Thank you. Wow. I am feeling, you know what? I can feel my blood already moving.
Yeah.
And I'm being mindful because I don't want to distract or detract from where we're going to go. But I had been molested from 7 to 17 years old. And this was against my will. I was not trafficked. But improper sex was happening with me that changed my life and caused me to have great issues later on, and how I then treated others. And took me a while to get my head around it and to correct behavior that I could own, and 12 steps as well, being a part of program and all of that. And I feel that while I have that story, it doesn't excuse behavior. Like, I'll just jump in with here and we can move around. So like with pornography, I have many friends, lovely, incredible, wonderful people championing the world, doing amazing things, who are addicted to porn. It wasn't a choice one day to like be addicted to porn. It was presented in ways that, at least for men, that it was ready, available. And what I started learning later was all of the people, not all, so many of the people, many of the ones that we were watching were not there because they could not wait to show up to work and to expose their bodies and to be treated in a way that was not respectful. I know that, again, this gets into choice, so I'm not judging someone who chooses to do this on their own and have a path. Although I do have an idea about that. I can't imagine anybody who would choose that if the world was balanced and men treated women fairly and saw them for their worth and not as sex objects, and to get off on a girl on screen that's 18 years old or 16 years old or 14 years old and even 30 years old at whatever age. And I'm almost done. I'm sorry. Even a woman who chooses to do it at 35, would they choose that if they felt more than what they have felt throughout their life and the way they were seen as objects? Mm-hmm. Even though it's their choice. Again, I'm being really mindful because I don't want to be on the wrong side and be yelled at.
But what about just to play with that a little bit? And thank you so much for sharing your story. And one of the things that comes up for me when I hear you say improper, a child cannot consent to their own exploitation.
Correct.
And that asymmetry of power with the adults who sexually exploited me, the grooming is, and we're going to talk about this with trafficking, I hope, the grooming is such a powerful psychological tool and technique that my psychology, when I was being commercially sexually exploited in Japan, is that I was a glamorous model. And the first thing that happened on the day that I walked into that office was the adults told me to take off all my clothes and walk around. And what I wrote in my diary was that I was so embarrassed. I did not want to do that. But there were also times when I was having my picture taken when I felt like I was a model and I was there because I was a beautiful girl who was doing a job for which I was being remunerated. But I look back on that and I understand that that is an underdeveloped frontal lobe, and that there were these systems at play that were exploiting me. And so I just wanted to add that part. And then when it comes to the pornography, there's so much research, and a lot of it lives on a website called Culture Reframed that talks about the effect of pornography on girls and women's perception of themselves, the self-surveillance, the shaming, the getting into the disordered eating, and we are a culture of pornification. Amazon, Netflix, and Twitter have fewer combined consumers each month than the porn sites. And 1 billion kids, not adults, but 1 billion kids are exposed to hardcore pornography. And these numbers are invisible because it's hidden in plain sight. It is the water in which we swim. And kids, 44% of kids 11 to 14 say that they want to try the pornographic acts that they see. And we know that 88.2% of pornographic scenes, not just in the movie, but the scenes contain violence against women. And we use all these euphemisms and we sanitize it. We say choking. That is asphyxiation. That is asphyxiation. Breath is necessary for life. And in the intimate partner violence assessment, which is done when a woman goes to the police because a man is getting ready to kill her, the last thing before homicide is asphyxiation.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there's a possibility, and both of you, obviously, is it possible to have ethical porn? Is it possible that people are able to consume intimate content or erotica that doesn't do harm to women, or is that kind of an impossibility?
I think it's like saying you can have smoking without cancer. And the reason I say that, and I would refer everyone to World Without Exploitation and their webinar series, and they did an entire webinar on this subject, and it can go into far more depth and detail than we have the opportunity to do right now. And they ask 10 crucial questions and put a stress test to it. Can it be ethical? And one of the core questions is, as Jamie was so rightfully interrogating, am I choosing from a full basket of choices? Do I have a history of sexual abuse in my background? What does my consent really look like? And then if I have consented and they upload that video, can I take that video down someday? Can I really get that video off the internet if I change my mind someday? And we know the answer to that is no.
So much of the underlying of this conversation really is about choice, right? And human trafficking ultimately is the exploitation of another person by corrupting their choice, right? By using force, by using fraud, by using coercion as a mechanism to control them. And it's not more than that, right? It doesn't need to be traveling across a border. It doesn't need to be, it's certainly not typically kidnapping, right? But Jamie, when you're talking about your experiences as a child, Ash is talking about, your experiences as a child, so much of what we think about when we try to simplify what human trafficking is for people is the ability to say, did somebody more powerful than you take advantage of your vulnerability?
Right.
And did they use that for their own good instead of for yours?
Mm-hmm.
And that's enough of a framing to be able to kind of start the conversation about what trafficking actually is.
Right.
Which leads us then, because as we're getting into trafficking and why for me I started with porn is because I feel if there's a market for something, then there's going to be more trafficking to feed the market. If we educated our young boys, and specifically talking about men, since I am one, I'm sure there are the other genders who contribute to it, but I think men are driving this. That's my understanding.
99% of sex buyers are male.
Thank you. Okay. I'm so glad you said that. I didn't want to say it and then be ridiculed, but I agree. And if it's 99, I think it's 99.9 probably. Right. But that said, if we reframe our young boys' thinking to respect and regard women and to see them as their sisters and mothers and spiritual beings and not objects, then maybe we won't want to see acts of violence or even any sort of pornography, which, by the way, I have watched, and I'm not demonizing those that are inspired or turned on to watch sexual acts. It's all around us. But if we reframe our thinking, then the market is less. If my own kids can be told to not watch it because this is what it does, then maybe the market is less and there's less of a need to traffic, talking about sexual trafficking, to fill that market. So yes, we need to fight against that, and I'm really interested to hear ways, Catherine, that we can do that. But I also think at the grassroots level, we have to raise our babies, our boys, differently to not see a woman as an object in that way. That you're okay with seeing your sister on a screen be fucked by a stranger.
It's almost worth going back a little bit, just a little bit, to say who is actually vulnerable when we're talking about sex trafficking, right? And who's vulnerable when we're talking about labor trafficking? The overwhelming majority of people who end up in sex and labor trafficking situations in the United States are people who have experienced a period of homelessness or housing insecurity, people who have histories of family, drug, and substance use. And we did a survey, Polaris did the largest survey of trafficking survivors in the country. 96% of them had experienced some form of abuse or neglect in their childhood before becoming a trafficking victim. And so when you think about what prevention looks like, for us, it's multiple things, right? It has to be multiple things. The first, of course, is being able to address what it is that immediately victims and survivors need if they're trapped in that situation. But right next to that is, how do we actually change the picture of vulnerability for people? If we know that young people are likely to be trafficked if they've been kicked out of their homes because they're LGBTQI+, and there are no shelters for trans youth, and there are no places that are safe for Black trans youth, then what are we going to do about that situation? Because traffickers, the first thing they'll do is to say, I'll give you a place to sleep. You just need to turn tricks for me, or you need to do something else for me, right? Mm-hmm. They will always go to the place, traffickers will always go to the place where there is an immediate material or emotional need, and they will meet that. And if we don't figure out as a society how to identify those vulnerabilities and start to meet some of those needs, there's no amount of arresting or, funding police to identify trafficking situations that's ever going to get us out of this problem, this human rights challenge that we've got.
So why don't we start with the definition of trafficking? So we're all working with the same terms, and that we have this ground zero definition from which we can then build out the rest of the conversation. And the Palermo Protocol, which is the UN instrument that defines human trafficking, says that it shall mean the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, which we know is quite unusual in America, or fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power or a position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. Exploitation shall include, at a minimum, the exploitation of the prostitution of others or other forms of sexual exploitation, forced labor, or services, slavery or practices similar to slavery, servitude, or the removal of organs. And the second portion is really important. The consent of a victim of trafficking in persons to the intended exploitation set forth is irrelevant. You cannot consent to being trafficked. Mm-hmm. And so it also, I think, is important to make sure that we understand and have agreement around what force means. It's to make someone do something against their will, with or without the threat of violence, to compel someone to do something. Fraud is wrongful deception for personal or criminal gain, to deceive someone. And then coercion is the practice of persuading someone to do something, and often includes taking away their resources. Mm-hmm. Which is part of the National Institutes of Health definition of coercion. Mm-hmm. If I manipulate your resources. And I just want to use an example from pop culture. The movie that's out right now that's nominated for so many Oscars, Poor Things, is such a fascinating film in so many ways. There's this moment when the Emma Stone character is prostituting herself in Paris, and she is a prostituted person, but there's a moment when she becomes a trafficked person, when the madam of the house, her pimp, says, oh, you have to do this, because if you don't, I can't feed my grandchild. Mm-hmm. That's emotional coercion. It's Correct. Psychological manipulation. And she goes, oh, and she goes upstairs and she lets a man, buy her vagina. Mm. Because if not, the baby in the house doesn't eat. So a prostituted person can be trafficked 1 minute and prostituted in another.
Mm-hmm. Right. Generally, there's kind of two approaches, right? Or I think there's one major approach to trying to end sex trafficking, which is, let's make sure that women and girls, don't live in poverty and don't live in dangerous circumstances where they're vulnerable to this kind of exploitation. I think that another one that I don't hear that much about is attending to the demand side. And yeah, who are the 99% of men who are doing this? Why are they doing this? There's not a lot of studies about how porn impacts the brain for men, because they can't find men who haven't watched porn, right? They actually struggle to find teenage boys who have not been exposed. So I feel defeatist, in sometimes in our approach of being, okay, we're going to just eradicate all of these things. But is there something that we can do to speak to men so that we can sort of attend to this issue at the source?
So who are the men that buy sex? They're white men with disposable income, and the majority earn over $100,000 per year. And there was a really good study of who male sex buyers are, and the report is available on demandabolition.org. And they buy predominantly Black and brown girls and women. And I do say girls. 1 in 6 girls who have been trafficked were trafficked before the age of 12, which I know you've talked about on your show. Mm-hmm. And there's a woman named Rachel Moran who wrote an extraordinary book called Paid For, and she talks about the push factors that pushed her into being trafficked. And she had social isolation in her family, a parent with mental illness and poverty. And she, went ahead and played up the fact that she was a teenager because it made the man, finish his ejaculation sooner and got her out of the car, out of the bed, out of the whatever. So being young can be advantageous. Actually, it's very dangerous, but it can also be advantageous to your safety and cause the person who's exploiting you to leave you alone faster. Mm-hmm. That's who some of the men are. And they buy predominantly, as I said, Black and brown. And if you're Native American, of course, we have the tragedy in this country of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And if you're a Black trans woman, you're at exceedingly high risk. Then there are the men who are permissive about it and let other men operate with impunity and say, oh, it's not for me, but dude, get your game on. Then collectively, there's the myth of the happy hooker and Poor Things. And I have another comment about that. That movie plays into that because there's this moment when she has prostituted herself and the first man who beats her up. And afterwards, she's sitting at her little boudoir table and she says to a fellow prostituted woman, he hurt me and I kind of liked it. Hmm.
Wow.
And it's just one of those moments where it reinforces the myth that you not only have the right to buy my orifices and that my orifices are a workplace, mm-hmm. and that somehow that serial body invasion is normal and can be safe, but you hurt me and I like it. And of course, that script was written by a man.
Yeah, when I watched that movie and then I was like, oh, it was written by a man, I felt very differently about everything I just experienced.
Yeah, on the demand side, I think there are multiple ways for us to be tackling this. One of which, of course, is we need to really rethink what it means to reward men. Like if you go back and you think about even this, the soccer player that just got, I can't remember what his name is now, but he's got like 43 different trophies and he just got put in jail for 4 years for sexual assault. His celebratory action was to sexually assault a woman. If you think about Robert Kraft and all of the buzz around him soliciting prostitution out of an illicit massage business where women from China had potentially been trafficked into these massage businesses, the explanation was, I'm lonely and I'm old, right? It's a very male gaze for justifying, for pretending like it's not harm. Mm-hmm. And what we're not doing is saying, well, wait a minute. Why is it that when you win a big game? Why is it when you have a birthday? Why is it when you get married? Why is it when you have your buddies together? The action is to go and commodify a woman, whether that is by having her come and dance for you or strip for you or going to a strip club or getting, whatever it is. Why are we using that as the cultural norm to say men get to commodify, men get to consume women as the act of celebration? And then together with what you just said, Jamie, like we're treating our young men like the way that they should learn about relationships, the way that they should learn about sexuality, the way that they should learn about women or girls is by going into a place where somebody who doesn't necessarily want to be there, or who, because her children are starving, has decided that her option is to take off all of her clothes.
Right.
That's what we're teaching young men about who women are and their place as men and as leaders, right? And so I think that's got to be part of the conversation about how we actually end this, the crime of human trafficking.
That's what I was going to ask. My body is, I feel so appreciative of you both. And
Catherine Chen, ladies and gentlemen.
yeah. God, I can feel it. My heart's racing.
Why is it racing?
Because I feel so like we are all about being a balanced, just world. And then I hear this and I think, what? Like, I don't have direct connection to trafficking. How do I stop on a tangible way, on a daily basis? How do I stop human trafficking, sexual trafficking, or labor, or whatever ways there are, female mutilation that's happening throughout the world, and as well, like things that are happening. I don't know how to do that tomorrow morning, except for I go, all right, I don't have to watch porn. So that's why it's so great to have a conversation with you, so that our listeners are us and your daily average person who just goes and clocks in and out of their work and goes to their family. What can we do tangibly to change and to stop this behavior that seems so daunting?
We probably are all a little bit more connected to it than we actually realize, because it is systemic, as Catherine was pointing out. And so, my attitude toward an LGBTQIA+ kid can influence whether or not that kid has a safe person and an ally. I may not have them in my home and put them on the street, which leads to them, a kid who's put on the street is contacted by a pimp or a trafficker in less than 24 hours.
Oh my God.
And I may not be the person who puts the kid out on the street, but I may be the safe person who gives that kid alternative housing or a safe place, or refers them to a resource that prevents them from being trafficked, at least right away. I may be the person in recovery who's not drinking and not drugging and doesn't contribute to a household that has drug and alcohol dependency and dysfunction that leads to the social vulnerability that's a push factor for a girl who ends up getting pimped. I can be that guy who disrupts male psychological sexual violence, like a young nephew of mine who's working at a car dealership and says that when the dudes, are talking to a woman and trying to sell her a car, as soon as she leaves the space or is out of earshot, degrades her, humiliates her, ridicules her, talks about her body. And he's like, I'm uncomfortable with that. That's not cool. Knock it off. We all have these small, because it's a spectrum, right? There's the egregious, I'm going to buy her vagina, I'm going to tear up her rectum, I'm going to ejaculate on her face, I'm going to live the primacy of the male orgasm and use women as objects and entertainment for my sexual satisfaction. And then I'm going to post about it on a message board. I just read one of these message boards last night. It's on Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, if you care to really, know what men talk about. And then I can also have these more subtle insertion points where I disrupt male sexual violence by these other methods I was just talking about. But we all have choices about living in a solution and not being a part of male entitlement to female bodies.
Right.
And I spend, I think Liz Plank spends more time thinking about this than anybody else. But I spend a considerable amount of time thinking about this myself.
Yeah, that there's obviously policy change, which the both of you are certainly focused on, and Catherine, you've been involved with for several years. There's also the culture that we're in, right? And policy reflects culture, and culture reflects policy back. Even just like growing up, like that every insult for a woman, right, is that you're like a prostitute, right? That you're a slut. That it's all related to your sexuality, and then that pimps. Like, I was 14 years old dancing to 50 Cent talking about PIMP, right? Literally a song glamorizing men who are in this line of, I mean, I don't know if one could call it work, but who exploit women, right? So even dismantling that goes a long way, I think, to create the kind of ecosystem where people are, energized to change things.
And the insult for a man is to feminize him.
Right. Yeah. The worst thing a man can be. And again,
Is feminine.
It is to be a woman, right? It's
Yeah.
and even when I think about your nephew, Ashley, I'm sure that maybe they talked behind his back when he left. If
He quit.
Oh wow, good for him.
He couldn't take it.
I mean,
Couldn't take it.
I think that's incredible. And what I love about this approach and what I hope we can see more of when it comes to these campaigns is talking about it, yes, as if you want to be a good guy in the world, and be a good man, be kind to women and be good to women. But also, like, what kind of guy buys sex? Like, I'm sorry, but like, what kind of man, like Robert Kraft, has to like pay women to be around you? And I think with Andrew Tate as a figure of, that he's very much revered by young men, he was involved with sex trafficking, right? I know that that case is probably pending, and we probably have to say allegedly. But to me, that was kind of a perfect opportunity for men to talk to their boys about how that's obviously bad for women, but is that the kind of guy that you want to be? Is that like, we do have to use a framing of masculinity, I think that's enticing to men. What kind of man do you want to be in the world, separate from obviously the consequences that it has on women. Am I making sense? Sort of like appealing to men's own ideal of what kind of man they want to be in the world, and that aligning with the kind of cultural and policy change that we want to see that makes women safer.
But I also think there's also just men as people and as citizens, and voters, right? And that there are a bunch of things that round out the cultural change that has to be there. That, like, as laws and policies shift, culture is also going to shift. And there are a bunch, right? So if you think about the vast majority of the way we think about human trafficking is that men, more than anyone else, think about their role in rescuing people who are trafficking victims. They're not thinking necessarily about holding the tension of how complex generational trauma, racism, gender inequity, economic inequity are. It's sort of like, I learned about an injustice. There must be an answer that no one else has come up with yet. And I part of what I hope that the folks who are listening to this conversation will take away is to resist that urge to say, well, all we need to do is X.
Right.
Well, all we need to do is Y.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's not going to get us to a solution. The way we're going to get to a solution is to actually unpack and to sit with a complexity.
What do you say, though, to women and just people in general who say, for some workers, this is a choice, and they do want to participate in this, and it is consensual, and that your approach is only creating more stigma for the people who want to engage in this kind of industry?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important that we have the conversation with dignity and respect, and that it is a longer conversation and it's not a sentence or a paragraph. And that we be able to hold each other with a lot of care.
Yeah.
And that the polarization around it just allows men to operate with impunity. And they're like, hey, ladies, knock yourselves out. I'm just going to go exploit more girls and women. So that's the first part that, of my answer to that. And the other part is, what about the right not to be trafficked? And what about the right not to be prostituted? I think that we always have to start with that specific framing. And, as Catherine knows so well, the majority of people who are trafficked and prostituted have no agency, have these complex factors of social isolation, of intimate partner violence, in their background, drug and alcohol dependency in the home, backgrounds of sexual abuse. There's incarceration. There's marginalization through being people of color. There are all of these vulnerabilities, being LGBTQIA+, and it's a choiceless choice. And if I am choosing, I'm choosing between not so great and really terrible. And I would never, deign to talk about it myself because I'm a survivor, but I'm not a survivor of prostitution. My understanding from being with a lot of survivors, and many of their stories are available on the website World Without Exploitation, and there are a lot of webinars out there where you can listen to survivors directly. There are psychological mechanisms at play that make the unendurable endurable. And that's just what I was invited to Paris to be with prostituted women who said they formally wanted to enter the Me Too movement because prostitution is sexual harassment. And they invited me to share that space with them. And so I would listen in a very careful and balanced way, and also know that a lot of that, the so-called sex work lobby is run by pimps, brothel keepers, and sex buyers, because they're the ones who are invested, who are driven by the profit, and want to keep the demand going. And there will always be a supply of vulnerable girls and women to meet the demand.
Ash is also bringing up, I think, that tension between the individual trauma that someone experiences and the bigger system that we at Polaris have been trying to shift toward, right? So we often talk about human trafficking as the natural outcome of racial, gender, and economic inequity. And I think there are so many good examples of this, how people end up doing something that appears to be choice. And there are people definitely who do choose, right, to engage in sex work. For us at Polaris, our focus is on sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So it's the people who don't have the choice. It's the people who can't get out of the situation when they want to get out of the situation. But for us to actually see a world where this is no longer a possibility for someone to be trafficked, we have to actually be changing the systems that allowed for it in the first place. And we have to acknowledge our history in order to get there. And the example that I would actually use is to sort of shift our lens a little bit and to talk about labor trafficking, because the majority of labor trafficking victims are actually men. The overwhelming majority of agricultural workers are people who are here in the United States legally on temporary visas, who are coming into the United States from Mexico and Central America, right? But how do agricultural workers end up in a situation where there are so many agricultural workers who are abused, who are unpaid, who are trafficked because their employers basically threaten them with deportation? It's because there are two industries in the United States that remain legacies of chattel slavery: the domestic work world and agriculture. And I'm sure there are many others too, right? But the majority of abuse and exploitation that is happening to workers in the United States is sitting in those two areas. And those two areas are the two that are not regulated under the labor law in the same way, because it was African Americans coming out of chattel slavery who were employed there. So when we think about how you actually change a situation, how do you actually end human trafficking? It's both holding the trauma pieces and the individual experiences and the transformational power of individuals who've lived through it. Many of the stories that Ashley is talking about, it's also holding those systems to account. And I think that's the thing. It's not only about how do men change their behavior or their perspective on commercial sex or on buying or on pornography consumption. It's also about whether or not you are anti-racist. It's also about whether or not you come to the table as somebody who believes that women should have equality, and that our economic systems also need to be changed so that they are more equal. Because that's how we end up with systems where people don't have to choose between feeding their kids and going out on the street, which is really the world of folks that we work with every day. We are the operators of the National Human Trafficking Hotline at Polaris. And every year we deal with about 10,000 situations of sex and labor trafficking.
Wow.
And the number of people who make those choices to have to do certain things in order to put food on the table for their kids and then end up in situations where the relationships they're in are highly coercive. I think those are the things that we've got to start to change.
So if anyone is listening right now who is recognizing themselves in some of these stories or knows someone who is being trafficked, what can they do?
So if you see yourself in any of the situations that we discussed today, call us at the National Human Trafficking Hotline. It's 1-888-3737-888. Again, that's 1-888-3737-888, or text us at Be Free. We're 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. We can help people in 200 different languages, and we're not law enforcement. So while we work with law enforcement, if you want to get connected to somebody who is trained on how to address human trafficking, we mostly focus on making sure that someone who is a trafficking victim has the resources that they need in order to get out. Or for somebody who was already a trafficking victim and they've gotten themselves out of the situation, if you want to try and better understand what happened to you, you need connections to lawyers, social workers, mental health counselors, childcare, flights to get to the places that you need to go to reunite with your family. We can do all of those things. And so reach out to us.
Amazing. And regardless of I guess, immigration status, right? People can call. It's
Correct.
It's anonymous. That's great. That's wonderful.
So can I ask a couple questions? I have a couple comments and also some questions. Is there a way for you to share, how long have you been doing this work, Catherine?
25 years.
Okay. And Polaris has been around how long?
For 23.
Okay. Would you say that over the, let's call it a 20-year period of time, the amount of trafficking was happening 20 years ago, 10 years ago, has that changed? Has it gotten more?
It's actually really hard for us to know, to be honest with you, because human trafficking is a hidden crime.
Great.
Right? It's about coercion. And I think one of the big misconceptions that is out there is that human trafficking looks like the movie Taken. It looks like kidnapping. It looks like white vans.
Right.
And the truth is it does not.
Does not.
Right? We often talk about this as like, it's not kidnapping, it's coercion. So it looks like intimate partner violence. It looks like domestic abuse. It looks like a really bad relationship or a really bad job. It does not look very typically like shackles and chains and tape and rope and whatever. And so I think that's one of the things that makes it very hard to count and very hard to know whether or not things are changing.
Okay.
I would also say that kind of coming out of the pandemic, we've seen a 40% increase in the number of calls that are called into the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Yeah. And so people's desperation, the fact that the safety net has fallen out from many, many people means that they're way more vulnerable than they were before 2020.
So thank you for that. So the reason why I ask is I'd imagine that's not to say that the work is not important, that it's not having impact. It's kind of like the old cliche or analogy of like a dam that's breaking. You have the wall that's there, and we spend a lot of time making sure that the wall doesn't break the dam. So we keep having people to repair the dam at the point of breakage. And thank God that there are people that are holding up the dam. But really, the real work has to happen back at where the water is entering this river. So it no longer, we don't even need a dam, right? So I wonder, where does this work fit? Is it at the dam, the place of like holding up laws and protection? My thought is, as simplistic as it is, but if we want a country to be better at math and to lead the world in arithmetic, we don't change 25-year-old men and reteach them math. We go back to our 5-year-old kids, and over 10 years of period, we inundate them with wonderful math, and then you'll see in 20 years we'll have better mathematicians, right? That's just how it works. If we want better men, I do not think that ultimately your average 25, 30, 35, 40-year-old man is changing that much. If they love certain ways of life, sure, we can change a few people here and there. But for the most part, our next generation, why is the work that you're doing not in all of my kids' schools? Why are they not learning at that age what we do to people? That we keep doing the work that you're doing, which is so powerful, but if it's not in my kids' schools, and their friends and understand the impact of when you are engaged in this, it then equals this. You're not bad for looking at porn. You're wonderful. It's natural to be interested in sex. But when you do, it does this and this and this. There's nothing wrong with drinking and alcohol per se, but know that when you do, it keeps the market going, and we have more people that are dying from bad choices, car crashes, horrible decisions that you make. Should your choice be not yours to drink alcohol? Of course it should be yours. But do you know that when we keep these things on the shelves, it allows for more people to make bad choices, for it to inundate society and humanity in ways that are more important than one person's individual choice to choose. And unless this is in our schools and my kids are aware of it, so I speak to this to say, in my neighborhood, my friends and my family, we have children's classes and we have junior youth programs that teaches them about equity and equality and compassion and love and joy and how to see each other as one family. This is the work. It's not religiously based, even though that's welcome as well. It's spiritually based in the sense of who we are. We're teaching our children so that in our neighborhood in 10 years from now, it might look a little different, that they treat their neighbors differently. They will not exploit. They won't steal from them. They will not sexualize their sister if they see their sister 10 houses down. So I'm wondering, sorry for being long-winded, and is the work you're doing, how do we have this be that my 7 and 8-year-old can tell me one day, like they are telling me about Harriet Tubman and Martin Luther King, thank God they're learning this in school, and they're learning other things, that they can come back and say, hey, Daddy, do you know that there's human trafficking happening? At 8, and this is the effects. What would that look like? Is there a way to, is that happening? Is there a way? Because in my life, it's not happening.
I mean, yes. And Jamie, thank you for that, because you give me a lot of hope. Because that's exactly what we need parents to be doing. You know, I think that right now we're in a place where the average person in public thinks that trafficking is white vans and kidnapping, thinks that it is only white girls, and thinks that it is people of color who are doing the pimping and kidnapping and all the rest of it, right? And so we have a very insidious misconception, misunderstanding about what the narrative actually is. To really actually end trafficking, it is exactly what you're talking about. And it's not only just how do you treat the girls and the women in your life, it's also how do you think about how we're all interconnected. If your chocolate is, you know, cocoa beans are being picked by a child in Congo, and that's what you get for Halloween, you're enjoying something that is based on the exploitation of others. If your Christmas lights are being made by Uyghur slaves in China, like, right? I mean, I could go on to this forever, but it's really about a next generation of kids who are able to harness what we've built as the generation before them, right? Interconnectedness, the availability of information, more compassion, more understanding about trauma, and that ability to say, I'm not going to treat people as consumable for me. And that's a hard thing for, I think, us in America, right? Without going kind of too far off onto a soapbox, like that's how our economy was built. It's built on the idea that we consume the labor and consume the identity of other people.
Right.
And so it's not a surprise that then this is also what we're seeing. It's just in its modern form. Do I think trafficking is getting better or worse? I think it's actually getting worse. And the reason for that is because, you know, what has allowed us to stay connected to each other and be intimately networked together online also allows for somebody who wants to exploit people, who wants to groom people, who wants to identify people who are vulnerable to do so more easily.
That's right.
So one of the things that we often tell parents, right, when you are talking to your kids about social media, or even if you're a young adult and you're thinking about a dating app, how do you think about understanding and protecting your own vulnerabilities so that they're not so easily exploited by somebody else? And not from a perspective of like you needing to be afraid of everything around you or anything like that. But if we know that somebody who has a history of substance use, drug addiction, and things like that in their families are one of the most likely to be recruited for a sex trafficking situation, don't put that on a dating app that you're in recovery. Tell that to somebody after you actually trust them, and actually once you actually believe that they're going to protect and hold that information, right? It's the same thing with kids. Like, how do we make sure that your kids who are playing Fortnite, your kids who are doing whatever else at Roadblocks, whatever it is that they're playing, that you're really clear about who they're talking to? Because the recruitment on social media, recruitment on video games, recruitment on dating apps, that's what has started to increase. The number of fake jobs that are available on Facebook that then lure migrant workers to the United States, right? That's how the internet is allowing for exploitation to grow at scale.
Wow, that makes a lot of sense.
And I think that those are the places where it becomes more than just about attitude, and how to sort of change somebody's vulnerability. It's also what is the position you hold in your career, in your life, in your family life, like you as a whole person. What do you touch that actually can contribute to changing the systems that allow for somebody to be exploited in the first place?
And I think this is such a amazing example of how feminism and just gender equality helps everybody. That if we were able to solve sex trafficking, and obviously it's a lot of women working on this, it does help men. You know, coming back to Ashley's point about grooming, which I would love to circle back to, like, what does grooming look like? You know, what are sort of some of the signs that aren't the white van, but to look out for?
You know, what we typically see is that a very, very common venue or a very common scenario for trafficking is actually that it's familial. And so that also went up during the pandemic, right? You have kids who are in their homes with their abusers. And that also feeds child pornography and other forms of online abuse. So when we're talking about kids who are living with their abusers, oftentimes it's layered trauma. So it might be sexual abuse, right? And then it turns into a level of willingness to do a lot of, exploratory things in terms of your own sexuality. And then it becomes a willingness to commercialize it. And then it becomes the person that you thought you were romantically involved with is actually now going to become your controller. Right. So that's often why we see so many people who have sexual abuse in their backgrounds and their histories ending up in situations where that boundary was crossed so early that it becomes quite hard to figure out where the healthy boundary is supposed to be. And somebody decides to jump in on that. For a lot of boys, one of the big problems is there aren't enough resources. There aren't enough shelters. There aren't enough tailored services. Everything is designed for kind of group homes for girls. And that's part of the reason why we also really do try to challenge at Polaris. We try to challenge pretty hard this idea that, like, all of us can kind of conjure an image. It's largely from like the Taken DVD cover or whatever, right? But it is like a blonde girl chained to a radiator that's like in the dark or dirty or something like that. And we challenge it so often because that's not who victims typically are. And if we don't help people understand that boys can be trafficking victims, that very often LGBTQ youth who are boys get victimized, Indigenous communities, immigrant communities, Black communities, if we're not thoughtful about representing all of that, then people who are being victimized also don't see themselves in this conversation, right? They don't believe that what they're experiencing is trafficking. They think it's a bad relationship or a bad job. So for us, it's extraordinarily important that we represent the diversity of who's actually vulnerable and who's actually being harmed.
I'm really glad that you brought up the grooming, because it is such a powerful strategy, and it's very cunning and it's very baffling. And pimps and traffickers are sometimes called Romeos or lover boys. And there was a young woman, she was 15 years old. She was in Nashville, Tennessee, and she was trafficked out of Nashville down to Atlanta. And when she was asked to testify, she said, "Oh, he's my friend. He got me a manicure." And it really spoke to the desperation of her family situation and how impoverished she was for love and affection and belonging from her major caregivers. And the attention that she got from this pimp was so insignificant to us, but it was so significant
Right.
to her that that's really all it took. And also there can be a situation within the trafficking where a woman will be something called the top hoe. And so she can be this maternal figure who praises the younger women, and kind of there's this hierarchy, and she can help kind of keep everyone in line. And I mean, it's a very complex social system in many ways, and it has its own ecology to it. But it's really about creating. It's maybe there. Maybe I wonder if anybody's done some studies on the parallels within gangs. It's a sense of safety. It's a sense of belonging.
I was going to bring that up. It's the same thing.
When people are coming from lack and deprivation, I mean, I was so vulnerable, but I was invisible. It's a miracle that I wasn't pimped or trafficked. I lived alone for 2 years as a child in Williamson County, Tennessee. I lived in a little farmhouse on Del Rio Pike. My mother and sister went on the road, just completely left me. I mean, my mom probably, there's no childcare in this country today in 2024. So what was she going to do in 1983? Say, hey, Joe Galante, the head of RCA, who's going to look after my other kids? She just left me in this house. And, there was no teacher or guidance counselor or a friend of a parent or anyone to look after me. There wasn't a neighbor who walked a dog on a schedule. Anybody could have come along. And it turned out that this guy who was looking for a billboard field in which to do a billboard for a cigarette campaign knocked on the door and said, hey, whose field is that? We'd like to photograph it. And he was a modeling scout. And that's how I ended up.
Wow.
Kind of long story made short, in Japan. But he could have done anything to me. And of course he said, I'm a modeling scout. And I said, well, come on in, And then after that year, I moved myself to Kentucky to live with my dad because that year didn't feel particularly good. And, my dad and I have a beautiful relationship today. My parents have been wonderfully restored in my recovery. With both of my parents, but he was drinking and drugging and just left me alone for, $50 in an envelope and went to Florida to do what he needed to do in his disease. And I lived alone in that apartment for a year. Wow. And anything could have happened to me. And I thought about running away, going down to Lower Broad in Nashville. And it's, in today's age, I would have been. I absolutely would have been. But my starving for attention is what would have made it possible.
Sure.
Because of the grooming.
Wow. Thank you for sharing all of that. I've interviewed men for my book who were brought into gangs when they were, still kids and teenagers, and it's so similar. It's, I think one of them described it. It was like getting into a gang is a lot like falling in love. I mean, it's just for the first time actually feeling like there's someone there for you if you're in a household where that's not happening, right? Where there's no support, and I think it's really. Also the way that to describe any abusive relationship, right? Men who end up being abusive or people who end up being abusive at first, they don't come in with hitting you, right?
They don't come in hot.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
They come in charming and it's wonderful, right? And so I think your description is really important to remember and not talked about enough.
If you had control over humanity for the next 5 years, or we're tasked with, we're going to fix this. You have 5 years. We're going to give you the most amount of money in the world to fund what you do. And in 5 years, we want to turn this around. What would be the curriculum for that? And tangible ways that I can understand.
How interesting.
What would you do with it so that...
didn't I just say resist the urge for a conference?
She just said that.
I know it.
Listen to women.
No. I'm sorry. I asked the question in the spirit of, we don't want I don't want just people to listen to this and do the work that, we're all set out to do. And then it comes in one ear and you're interested in entertainment for an hour and you're like, oh, I learned some new stuff. I Wikipedia'd something. And then you're on to your next thing. But if it's here's what we could do, and I actually see that this would shift, what would that might look like? That communities and families and things, a curriculum that you feel would show progress in maybe that a period of time. Is there some sort of concrete answer you could give to that?
So a couple things come to mind for me. One is universal basic income, health insurance, things, poverty alleviation.
Yes.
Right. And helping people be stable. But it has to go simultaneous with gender equality and ending male entitlement to female bodies. These things have to be concurrent. And how does one do that? You talked about curriculum, so that's really what I'm focusing on. Culture Reframed has a porn critical sex education curriculum that should be in schools. Right now, it's primarily for parents and pediatricians and nurses, and I would have that in every school. I mean, it's a wonderful question. It's a big, sweeping, magic wand question, so I'm just kind of rapidly processing.
No, it's perfect.
I'm also thinking about, because I've physically been in brothels since 2004, and I'm thinking about trauma-informed healing for girls and women and the trans folks with whom I've sat, or the trash pickers in India, or the guy who lived in this little tiny room where he made rugs in India and had his broken mirror that's mounted on his wall, and he was looking in the mirror. Our eyes caught, and I said, "When you see yourself in the mirror, what do you see?" And he said, "I see a child of God." And that's how he regarded himself, even though he was in indentured servitude. It was this really beautiful moment that passed between us. And so exit strategies and, housing, not handcuffs, and all of the things that survivors need to rebuild their lives with dignity and choice. Dental care. One of Catherine's and my friend, she was saying that, there are these patchwork of services that are often determined by people who think they know what survivors need. And what she really needed was a new set of teeth because her pimp had knocked her teeth out.
Right. Yeah, and just more, regulations. I mean, we haven't gotten into AI, which I'm, afraid is going to make people more depressed. But just the guardrails, right, that just haven't been put in place. It's gotten a lot of attention with pornography and deepfakes, and the pace, it's moving very fast. Because of the pace, it can just be exponential. And I do feel like, I don't know if our 89-year-old congressmen, who don't even understand like what a UTI is, or can't even understand like, or do sort of basic policy when it comes to women's bodies and sort of the healthcare that we need, are sort of equipped to understand the threat that poses to women. I'm curious, has it come up at all in your work that a child wouldn't even need to come into physical contact with a predator and be exploited?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, that comes up quite a bit, and it's a very live conversation right now in Washington, where we're based. There's a lot of legislation that's being introduced in Congress right now to try and regulate that. But I also wanted to come back to Jamie's question around like 5 years, unlimited wealth and resources. I would do very similar to what Ashley said, but I would think about it from a particularly data-driven perspective. We did this study that was the largest study in the United States of what survivors went through. How did they become trafficking victims in the first place? And they became trafficking victims because of traffickers. Let's start there, right? And those traffickers were responding to demand, for sure. But they also, like 86% of them grew up in poverty. 96% of them came from families with, abuse in their backgrounds. People did not have enough to eat. People had mental health issues and substance use issues. And so I would also get really specific, right? I think it is addressing poverty. That doesn't have to be global right now. That could be very, very local. What we saw during the pandemic in 2020, with the fact that there were eviction moratoriums and people cared about where people lived, we actually saw a dip in trafficking in those years.
Wow.
It wasn't until after the moratoriums expired and the safety nets started to disappear and we stopped caring about the most vulnerable in our communities that all of this came back. right? Trafficking happens because our systems are broken. And so to me, we start with the fundamental, which is we don't have enough economic equity. We don't have enough, base income equity in the United States. And with that comes trauma. With that comes choices that lead to kids being vulnerable. With that comes parents being at their wits' end and needing to use other mechanisms in order to try and deal with their kids. And all of that just snowballs, right? So for me, it really is actually guaranteed basic income, which Ashley has helped us launch a program focused on that already. But it's starting with that. Do people have enough money to put food on the table for their kids and a roof over their heads? And if they do, a lot of this starts to dissipate.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's just fascinating to me.
And I would even say that traffickers need an alternate income stream too. They need an alternate income generation as well.
Wow.
Because many of them get into it because of the intergenerational poverty in their households and growing up with addiction and hustling. And there's prostitution and trafficking within their homes. I mean, a really good friend of mine, he, grew up calling his mom's pimp daddy.
Wow.
And that's how he got into the game.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
It's fascinating to me how at the end of it, it comes down to human connection, seeing each other as equals and caring about one another. You don't let your sister typically in your own home go without, or your brother or your cousin. And then oftentimes it stops there. So we do have to see the world, as cliche as it is, as one human family. All these things that are these ills of the world ultimately come out of the fact that we are not connected, that we think about ourselves. How do I just think about me and not the country next door and not the people next door? So it's just, that's ultimately in your answers. It just reminds me then about education, and really while we are holding the dam and making sure that there are less people hurt in the current year, how do we prevent it 10 years from now and 20 years from now? And I think it has to go back to our children and raising a culture and a society that thinks differently, so we don't have to protect them in the same way that we have to protect people now. So I'm really grateful we're having this conversation. I will say to our group of men that listen, if I ever at any point vilify you for being who you are, I'm really sorry. We're trying to be our best selves and feed ourselves and think about it. But we have to be better. And we can't allow this. Like, our true masculinity and manhood and contribution to society is to listen and to hear these things and to look at our own choices and think like, so me doing this maybe by itself doesn't seem so bad, but if me doing this contributes to this, this, and this, and perpetuates systems that hurt humanity, then we have to be better. And I'm so sorry for all the people that experience this. And I think about women. Of course, I hear about men that when we bring this up about the trafficking, what happens to men, my heart goes out. I don't know why I disassociate a little bit. I have less tolerance to hear about how men are mishandled and hurt, because there are for sure men that are hurt, I know, and trafficked, and I don't want to dismiss it. But the vulnerable have been women and children. Anyways, so with that, I'm really grateful we've done it. I know that we need to wrap up. Are there any closing?
Well, we have our closing question. I mean, I have a million thoughts and going through my mind too. And I think just the kind of boring causes, feminist causes, like, the gender gap, right? Like the feminization of poverty, right? These are things that maybe like men don't see as like a sexy cause to get behind, but that is at the root of all of this, right? Like if you fight for a world where women and men, right, there's not this huge gap between our financial stability, then sex trafficking is harder it's harder for it to happen, right? And then we do need transformative societal change, but it becomes so much, less of this big thing that we need to change overnight. So this was so informative, and I know we'll have a lot of people thinking and talking and commenting. And again, to Ashley's point, we want to encourage conversation. I think that that's a wonderful thing in a democracy to disagree. And so if you do disagree, that's great. That's proof that,
Wait,
we're talking.
What'd you say? Say that again?
What? Which part?
It's okay for people to disagree with what?
I think there will be people who I'm almost sure who believe that this conversation will
I have no
make
tolerance for
sex
that.
workers more at risk. And
Someone come knock on my door and come see me if you disagree with the fact that children and people should not be trafficked. Come see me on my door. I'll give you my address. Call me up because I got a problem. Because I don't think we have to. Thank you for that, Liz.
Well, let's reframe that we should be diminishing male entitlement to female bodies.
Yes.
Great.
There we go.
Love that.
We can agree on
And
that.
that when men believe that they can and should buy women's orifices, it objectifies and commodifies all women everywhere, because you don't go out over lunch and buy one blowjob and then sit in the cubicle next to another woman and think of her any differently from the woman you just bought.
I appreciate that framing. I get a little sensitive when me, I do this to myself. We are so careful. There is truth. And we should not have to apologize for truth. There are certain things that hurt people. And I'm not worried about if I offend a few people in the meantime while standing up about a truth that's generally seen as a universal truth. Then people can be upset.
Well, and I'll just say, I know that we have to wrap up. I was mentioning that I read a sex buyer's message board last night. And they are sex buyers from across New York State. And what they said was truthful. It was their assessment of the women whom they had purchased, and it was offensive. And so if I can say male entitlement to female bodies in response to what they're saying about women's, she was using, I didn't care, go ahead, treat yourself. It's just, we're talking about truth, and truth can be uncomfortable, but when we know better, we do better. And
Sure.
So what I'm really trying to get at underneath it all is, take a look at your indifference to the humanity of your sisters.
Wow. And I just think
Thank
it's
you.
good to be talking about it, right? Because I think the worst thing for anyone who's involved is for this to stay in the dark, right? And for these conversations not to come to the light of day. So
Agreed.
I really appreciate that both of you coming on and being willing to talk about all of this with us. We usually do close with a question. Do we have time or yeah. So do you want to ask it?
You ask it.
Okay. So what does it mean to you to be man enough? What does that bring up?
It's having enough of a sense of yourself that the world does not need to be about you.
Amen to that.
What a beautiful question. And I two men came to my mind, my pop and my partner. And I can be pretty strong and assertive in my beliefs, as may have been somewhat evident during this conversation, particularly in the last 2 minutes. And I think that, they really allow me to be me and free from any digs or commentary or eye rolling or elbowing or nudge, nudge, wink, wink. And it seems pretty clear to me that they're a man enough in themselves to let me be in my truth and to shine.
Love it.
I love it.
And I think that that's pretty neat. And, and then my invitation is to really believe that, and to accept their unconditional love without self-surveilling myself.
Love that.
Yeah. Wow.
So important.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful that we are able to have this conversation with the two of you. So dedicated to it, care about it so much, and also articulate in a way that it can be absorbed. Sometimes we can feed someone something that it's just hard for them to swallow, but I think you both do it in such a way, and you have every right to scream it at the top of your lungs or to serve it in honey. However way you choose is your right. But oftentimes when you do serve it with honey, it's easier for people that we need to listen to swallow, and you do it with such grace, and thank you for that.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you, Catherine, for trusting me to have this conversation with you. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Liz.
Thank
really
you.
appreciate both of you.
So wonderful.
Dream team.
Wow, you guys are a
Yes.
team, that's for sure. So this has been amazing. Thank you so much. Just before we sign off, Would you mind just giving the numbers and the data really quick where people can find you?
Sure. To reach the National Human Trafficking Hotline that Polaris operates, call 1-888-3737-888 or text us at BeFree. And the Polaris website, it's polarisproject.org. And one resource, we have a Human Trafficking 101 that they can take. It's a pretty robust course that you can actually take. You get a little certificate at the end that you can post on your social.
Wow.
And I think it's largely appropriate for all ages. And so maybe under 10 is a little much, but otherwise, that would be great if you all would be willing to share that.
Thank you so much for that reminder. It's really important to have that in there.
Yeah.
With that, we're going to sign off. And thank you for those of you who have joined our episode. You can get more next week and so on and so on. You can find us at manenough.com/podcast and all the places you hear podcasts. YouTube, you can watch this episode on YouTube. And until then, I am Jamie Heath.
I'm Liz Plank.
And this is
Man Enough.